This is Secure Cyber Connect podcast with Jay Adamson and Warren Atkinson, where we're joined by information and cybersecurity technology and talent acquisition professionals who share their journeys, unique perspectives, and offer advice and guidance. Our topics on this episode will be ISO42001, the role of legal in cybersecurity governance, NIST and DORA. Today, we're truly honoured to be joined by Annick O'Brien. Annick is General Counsel at CyberSafe and is a highly experienced and qualified lawyer with an extensive background of global business accomplishments. An expert in defining, driving and maintaining compliance and risk management frameworks, she aligns compliance to the business value chain. Annick is a proponent of culture change with an extensive impact on corporate conduct, training and awareness, and a specialised focus on cyber, privacy, data protection and information security. She specialises in laws such as GDPR, NIST and DORA, and most recently has been focusing heavily on the EU AI Act. Her passion is in helping businesses to incorporate new requirements into business practices in both a safe and sustainable way. She writes and speaks regularly on the topics of how these laws interact within the challenges of human cyber risk for organisations. And she's the proud winner of the GRC Head of Legal of the Year Award 2024. An infectious enthusiasm and a knack for bringing a sparkle to legal and data security conversations makes Annick one of those rare people who make GDPR almost tolerable, with her inspirational, entertaining, and a general take on privacy. Annick, welcome to the Secure Cyber Connect podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jay. I am delighted to be here. And thank you for that warm introduction. It's a little bit embarrassing to listen to somebody list off your achievements, but I think it's important that we as women and as lawyers speak out and list our achievements. So I'm here on behalf of everybody who's like me, a little bit shy and often doesn't talk about the things that they've done. We should get comfortable with it. And maybe as we end 2024, that could be a great New Year's resolution for a lot of our listeners to think about 2025 and to take ownership of our successes whilst not stepping out of being polite and being modest at the same time, being able to say, thank you, I have done all this and I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited to talk about the different laws that have come in recently. But more importantly, I'm not here to try and turn everybody into a lawyer. I do want to talk about how we can incorporate those laws into business. So this podcast should be all about me trying to give tips and techniques for how organizations can really get operational about these things, just demystifying them, taking away all that legalese and jargon and really thinking about what can I practically do in my business to make sure that I'm ready for these types of laws.
Absolutely. And before we sort of get into it, we typically always start things off by asking our guests if they'd be kind enough to share something that they are proud of or excited about, or maybe just want to shine a light on that isn't to be found on your LinkedIn profile.
I think one thing that I'm super proud of that I do quite regularly and have done with quite some success is bringing departments together so that we don't have silos within organizations, having those conversations internally and with customers and clients whereby you see that light come on and people understand how it's relevant to them. And it's not just the legal department or the DPO coming with a no, because I do hear people say the DPO is the deal prevention officer, not the data protection officer. So it's really about kind of bringing that positivity and having people be able to be in a position where they can understand how this impacts them, how we're all trying to work together to maintain the compliance with the laws, but also advance the business. Because my job essentially is to get the business moving forward, not merely to sit and ensure that we comply perfectly with every single law. So this is one of the things that is in some ways quite difficult to shine a light on LinkedIn. But I think if you spoke to any of the people that I've been working with over the last few years, they'd say that I am that person who floats between departments, making sure that everybody knows that I'm here to bring their department along, to shine the light on their department and to help them be operational whilst maintaining that compliance and whilst moving towards the way the industry and the regulation needs us to go.
Absolutely. And do you have a sort of particular situation or a challenge that you faced in your career that maybe shaped your views on cybersecurity?
I think one thing that definitely affected how I look at cybersecurity is when I saw organizations assuming that this was an IT risk, that this could be solved solely with technology and it was the responsibility solely of the IT department. And then the GDPR came along, and that was the first piece of legislation that people took seriously that really made it a more legal and operational challenge. And what happened there was that finally organizations were required to be transparent. So it wasn't necessarily that organizations were required to change everything they did, even though a lot of change did take place, but they were required to understand what data they were collecting, how they were processing the data, what they were doing with it, and how they were getting rid of it. And for that, they needed a DPO. So suddenly we saw a lot of organizations who had lawyers looking at the GDPR, looking at data processing agreements. We had DPOs come into the equation. And for once, it became not just an IT problem. Article 32 GDPR, talking about the risk associated with processing of data, talking about technical and organizational measures, that article was the one place where we saw the lawyers and the IT department come together, and we saw that realization where we realized this isn't an IT problem. It isn't even a legal problem. This is a business problem. And there's responsibility on two parts. People often talk about organizations needing to take responsibility for cybersecurity and data protection. But lawyers and IT professionals have a responsibility to communicate well and to show the business how they can enable them and not prevent deals or create new processes, which is going to slow everything down.
And we're obviously going to talk quite a bit about ISO 42001. There's obviously been a lot of interest and focus, and for that matter, a lot of uncertainty about this and what it represents in terms of a large shift towards a more structured and sustainable cyber risk management within AI. Can you define how this standard has reshaped the relationship between compliance and security, and particularly in light of recent data breaches?
Sure. So ISO 42001 is the ISO international standard on managing AI. It's about developing and deploying AI ethically and ensuring that you have all those pieces around transparency, safety, compliance. So it's modeled on management standards like 27001. So that's the information security standard. So if you have that, you're already in a good place because many of the structures and the framework is similar. So it's really just about building on what exists already. Key elements there are very much focusing, as we see a lot of legislation these days, focusing on things like leadership commitment, operational guidelines, training, awareness. So it's not just about bringing in a particular IT standard. It's not just about ensuring that you've got some kind of firewall. It really is about developing the AI and deploying the AI in a way that's both ethical. And the first way of being ethical with anything that you do, and this is, I guess, my catchphrase that I always end up saying in every single webinar that I speak on or podcast, compliance is not just about doing the right thing. Compliance is about showing that you're doing the right thing. So in transparency, you need to be able to demonstrate that you're doing the things in a particular way. You need to, and for that, you need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to communicate it. It needs to be written down in a place that people can access it. So what's really important about 42001 is that we're looking at a framework that requires us to have that demonstrable compliance in place. So what that means is not just about trying to do your best as you're developing it, but writing out those measures, writing out those explanations about how it should be used, what to do if you see something happening that maybe shouldn't be happening, and then we can go back and we can tweak it. Because we're also trying to tell businesses this isn't merely about deploying something perfect and having it perfect all the time. This is about testing it, bringing it back, tweaking it, testing it again, letting people explore it, letting people develop it. And one thing that I think is really important to mention, this standard is about the compliance framework. It doesn't explain how AI works. So a lot of people and a lot of organizations have a certain amount of apprehension when it comes to AI. This standard will not necessarily show how AI works, but what it will do is it will encourage organizations to have more documentation in place so that when AI is being developed, and deployed, there is that transparency, there is that governance, there is that continual monitoring, and we do see those improvements and developments in how it works. So I think that's really important for people to remember, that whilst you're not going to get that full explanation of how AI works, you will get more technical documentation, more user documentation, more ability to highlight things that may or may not go wrong. And this, of course, is very similar to the EU AI Act. And we do see in these pieces of legislation a lot of similarity and the same thread running through.
And from companies not just wanting to tick boxes for a compliance, what are the proactive steps should legal teams be taking to embed ISO 42001 into their organizational culture?
This is a really interesting question, because sometimes when we're talking about what legal should do, I often say, and it might be quite controversial, there are some things that legal should do, but there are also some things that legal shouldn't do, and that you should be cautious about developing and engaging in. It's legal's responsibility primarily to kind of create that framework to enable the business to maintain compliance whilst developing and building on their business value chain. So in a way, what legal is trying to do is trying to fit into existing business practices so that the compliance framework can flow with the business and how the business makes money. And what we're doing is we're continuing to do what we do as a business whilst doing it in a safe way and in a demonstrably compliant way. What legal should not do is try and create new business processes, because businesses are built and full of people who know way more about their jobs than the lawyer does. So it's not the lawyer's role to come in and say, we have this new process that everybody needs to do. It's the lawyer's job to come in and say, what does the business do? Okay, how can we modify that slightly? How can we create that in such a way that we're including these new requirements, that we can demonstrate these new requirements? So in that way, I think it's very important for legal to remember where they sit in the organization. So it is their underlying responsibility to ensure that that risk framework exists, and only they can build that into the existing business practices and align it to the business value chain. But they're not to create new processes, because that is how we see things like shadow IT being created, or people just ignoring the process and doing things completely outside of process because the process that is being brought in and put on top of them is slowing them down. I think another thing to remember is the lawyers will be very concerned with maintaining the shareholders' rights and responsibilities here. So what the lawyers will be trying to do is communicate both upwards and downwards within the organization to ensure that each aspect of the organization understands where their risk sits and what things they can do, what steps they can take to manage and to mitigate those risks. So that's really important. A lawyer's job is not to absorb the risk and to determine yes or no, go or no go. The lawyer's job is to really be able to align those risks, communicate those risks, and put those risks into terms that that business understands. And only you, as the in-house legal or the solicitor or lawyer representing that company, working for that company, that's why you really need to understand what that business does, because you need to go that step further and take it out of the risk legal discussion and put it into the business and business value chain discussion, and that's where you're going to have the most impact. So I think when you ask me what should lawyers do, I'm also talking about what I think lawyers should not do, because if you try and do something that doesn't align with the business value chain, you will alienate people, you won't have people on board. And from my point of view, the most successful projects I've ever worked in are not the projects that I created the success. They're the projects where I managed to communicate in such a way that the rest of the business understood why it was important to them. And then they went away and created the process. They went away and understood what they needed to do and how they needed to record it in such a way that we achieved that compliance we were looking for, and at the same time maintained the business value chain. And the one thing that's really special there is it was their project. They created it, they maintained it, and they continually tweak it and make it better and absorb it into how the business is changing. So in that way, I don't have to continually monitor that because it's theirs, it's not mine.
No, that's brilliant. I think it's important to establish, trust, honesty, and of course accountability for our teams. I think technology and security leaders really need to pivot and look for legal teams as allies and advocates. And as you mentioned, bridging that gap between the C-suite and other areas of the business, of course, is going to be critical moving forward.
So we're all acutely aware as the cyber industry matures that legal teams are no longer just seen as gatekeepers, but more as active drivers of security culture. How would you define the evolving role of legal within cybersecurity governance?
I think lawyers have a really important role to play in moving forward from that position of being merely a legal advisor to being a business advisor, to being seen as a business enabler. And what we're looking at here is we're seeing these lawyers being responsible now for more around ethics, more around corporate responsibility. And this is where we see them contributing significantly in really moving the business forward. They are helping to establish both internal and external policies, codes of conduct, and all of these codes of conduct and policies help align with that operational resilience that we're seeing in many of the new pieces of legislation. So not just legislation as it relates directly to cybersecurity, but other pieces of legislation as they relate to marketing laws or whatever it may be, all have that element of operational resilience. And that is where a lawyer can really add value to a business by creating those areas whereby operational resilience can become part of the business value chain and is not an extra layer of compliance on top of it. We see lawyers being in positions where they can support boards, because we see more emphasis being placed on boards and boards' responsibility to ensure that cybersecurity is something that's an important topic on the board's mind. So in that way, we can see lawyers helping board members and executives on critical issues like data security, information, AI, ethics, data privacy, all of those topics. And we also see lawyers playing a really important role in that expertise that they can bring to legal compliance, to building framework, to ethical practices. And in this, we can see lawyers play an important strategic role with working with the business, both in terms of working with HR and working with any training that might be going on, to ensure that from bottom up, we have a culture of trust, as Warren mentioned earlier, whereby people are in a position where you're not trying to turn everybody into a lawyer, you're not trying to turn everybody into the CISO, but they know enough to make safer digital decisions, but they importantly know enough to have a question when maybe something's gone wrong or something doesn't seem quite right. They are in that environment of trust whereby they can raise their hand and they can say, something might have gone wrong, I'm not so sure what to do here. And then we can have that business enablement situation whereby there are channels that they can ask those questions, they can raise those concerns, and then we see the lawyer being involved in both the bottom-up approach to cybersecurity and the top-down, from the board down. And being involved in both of those channels is where you can create the maximum amount of support for the compliance. You can create that trust within an organization, and you can really be seen as a business enabler.
Warren touched on this earlier, but of all the relationships that you need to effectively partner with within the business, the technical teams are often the most challenging. How do you create a more sort of holistic and resilient strategy that addresses the legal risks and the operational needs?
I think the importance with working with the technical teams is being there early and being there often. And I do enjoy a party, and I don't always need to be invited to the party. In fact, I'm quite happy to gate crash a party. So all of my technical teams that I've worked with know that I will be there, probably whether or not I'm invited. So I think it's important to have thick skin and to come and to remember that I talk a lot about communication being very important. 80% of communication is listening. So when you are the lawyer in the room, it's not necessary for you to talk all the time and to raise all the risks and to highlight all of the negative things that could happen. 80% of the time should be listening to their ideas, listening to the way they work, listening to what they want to do, what's their end game. And in that way, you can come with ideas that say, I have understood that we're working on this project and our end goal is X. Now, one thing that's important for me is Y. I think we can achieve X and Y by doing it this way. How does that work? Does that create extra development for you? Is that something that you think you could do? And in many situations, I've found that the earlier you get involved, when it's still in ideation phase, you can actually build in things. And when we talk about privacy by design, often privacy by redesign, security by design, being involved in those very early stages mean that the engineers or the developers can actually create that technology in such a way that it does all of the things you need it to do. It's transparent. You can write out quite easily and quite simply what it's doing. It has privacy by design embedded into it. So users are the controllers of their data. So from the very beginning, you're building that technology in such a way that users can modify, delete, get rid of all their data, correct their data, restrict any processing within the technology that might not be necessary for the purposes of what that technology is doing. If you build that in early, if you have your ideas as part of the ideation phase, this can run quite seamlessly. The hardest part is when the project is finished and everything is built, and then you're trying to reverse engineer privacy into it, or you're trying to unpick it to understand what's happening so that you can write a data privacy notice, or there might be external parties, or you might be using open source. If you're involved in those types of things early on, you want to get your data protection agreements, or even you might need to do a DPIA, a data processing impact assessment. If you are processing data that in some ways might limit the rights and freedoms of individuals, if you're processing data that could be seen as sensitive, or even financial data about vulnerable people, these are the types of things that the lawyer will want to do a risk assessment on. And what's really great about that is if you do your risk assessment early, you can guide the business in such a way that you can manage and mitigate risks without re-engineering any of the technology. What's also really great about that, because I do love to reuse my risk assessments, is that for 42001, which we talked about earlier, you can reuse those risk assessments in showing the compliance, in showing the governance. And I always say to lawyers, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Look at the existing processes, build into the existing processes in the business, and reuse your risk assessments. Have them built in such a way that they can satisfy the GDPR requirements. They can satisfy, if you've got a DORA requirement, a Digital Operational Resilience Act requirement, the EU AI Act 42001, even 27001, you can reuse those risk assessments. So in that way, I think if you think smart about it, you can actually do things in such a way that you're reducing the workload and maximizing the impact.
No, that's brilliant. And on the framework side of things, we see NIST being one that's gaining significant traction globally at the moment. For our listeners, how would you best define the core principles of NIST, and what are the legal implications for organizations who fail to adhere to NIST standards?
Okay, so NIST is actually a really interesting one because NIST has changed recently, and there are the 5 pillars. So there's identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And recently they've introduced this new kind of NIST 2 governance, which underlies all of those: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And what I find really interesting about that is having this underlay of governance ties directly into the ISO 27001, the 42001, even the EU AI Act and DORA, and that whole idea of operational resilience and governance. How can you show that you're resilient? How can you show that you can bounce back from some kind of event if you haven't tested it, if you don't have policies in place, if there aren't procedures, if you haven't introduced your TOMs, your technical and organizational measures as required by Article 32 GDPR, to ensure that you have that security that you need in place. So what I think is really important about NIST at the moment is we're looking on those principles of security and privacy, trustworthiness. How do we get trustworthiness? Well, we're honest and we're open with people. That's the privacy notice in GDPR. We only use the data for the reason that we said we'd use the data. We only take the data that we need. These are the minimization and data restriction principles in GDPR. So again, what we're looking at is we don't need to have a whole new NIST framework. We just need to be thinking about how can we identify those risks? Have we done proper risk assessments? Okay, now we need to protect the data. How can we protect it? Through our Article 32 TOMs, technical and organizational measures. We also need to understand how to detect things. So we might have the trust-based culture in the environment that I spoke about earlier, which is people having a channel whereby they can raise risks. There's also technical ways of looking and detecting any kind of risks. Then we have respond. Okay, so respond is what we're going to do if something goes wrong. And this is where operational resilience is an underpinning important aspect of all of the legislation and regulation that we see over the last few years. And recover. recover is about operational resilience. It's that if something goes wrong, we know what to do, we can limit the amount of damage that this thing does, and then we can recover. And often we see organizations, and you're required to have this in 27001, looking at what point, the recovery point objective, what point you're going to go back to, and your recovery time objective, how long is it going to take you. So I think when we're looking at NIST, I am going back to my original point of reusing what you've done already. Don't do extra work and create new processes and procedures. You can embed NIST into your organization in the same way, overlaying it with GDPR, overlaying it with ISO 27001. So any organization that's working in the UK or in Europe will have GDPR compliance, the Data Protection Act 2018 in the UK, GDPR in Europe. And from there, you can reuse a lot of what you're required to do in order to have those basic principles of NIST and even 27001, 42001.
And for those leaders that are perhaps ignoring the NIST regulations and the recommendations there, in particular in relation to GDPR, what's the cost to the business of that? What's the financial risk there?
This is one that always makes me smile, because when GDPR came out, everybody spoke about the 20 million fine and the 4%. NIST 2 and DORA also have the fines of 2% and 10 million, whichever is the higher. I kind of think about things on a more personal and operational level, which is that in the UK, if you're misusing a computer, using a computer for fraud, accessing data that you shouldn't access, that's actually a breach of the Computer Misuse Act. There's only a £5,000 fine, which sounds like way less money, but there's also a prison sentence attached. And I would be much more concerned personally as a director or leader in a business if there was a prison sentence attached to something I was doing, because in some ways organizations looking at money can try and figure out insurance or how you can pay a fine, but when there's a prison sentence involved, you can't pay that off. So what I think about is we should be holistic in our approach. First of all, you could have personal liability here. That's something nobody wants. There could be huge financial liability for the business, but most importantly, you will undermine and destroy any trust you have with customers. And trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild. So people who don't know a lot about cybersecurity or who don't know a lot about data privacy they're reading the newspapers and they know what organizations are having data breaches. And when I talk with friends of mine who don't work in this area, they know which organizations have had data breaches. They can tell you, and they think that's not a secure organization. I don't want to use that organization. I'm not going to name any of the organizations because a breach can happen to all of us. But what I would say is people who are not heavily involved in data protection and information security will know about a data breach. They won't necessarily know about all the great things you do, but they'll hear about a data breach. So you do not want to break that trust, and you do not want that bad press.
Most definitely. I think we need to celebrate a lot more successes in the industry as well, because there's too much emphasis put on the negative sort of some media and news that's put out there. And just pivot into DORA, as you mentioned it a few times during the call, certainly being a significant game changer for financial service organizations as well as legal firms out there. So for our audience, could you define the core objectives of DORA and also explain how does this challenge some of the other traditional and existing compliance strategies that are out there globally at this time?
Sure. So DORA is the Digital Operational Resilience Act. It is a piece of regulation that is a requirement in Europe, but also for financial institutions who are selling into Europe or who are managing the personal data or finances of EU citizens. What's interesting about DORA is it's very wide-reaching in what it defines a financial institution to be. So it includes reinsurance, it includes crowdfunding, organizations. It's not just banks in the traditional sense. So it's very, very wide reaching. And there are lots of principles in DORA, but I'll pick out three because I always think three is a kind of an easy number to remember. You're required to have an operational framework. So you need an operational resilience framework. Again, pulling back to NIST, that's about respond and recover. going back to GDPR, it's Article 32 TOMS, technical and organizational measures. What is your operational resilience framework? And to have that, you need to have it documented. So that's an important element that I'd say I'd pull out of NIST, or of DORA. Secondly, I would say third-party management is a place where we see a huge amount of change. Prior to this, most legislation requires organizations to behave in a particular way. DORA requires organizations to monitor third parties. It puts the responsibility on the financial institution to ensure that their ICT third-party providers are behaving in a particular way, that they have certain security in place, that there are certain contracts in place. So I think that's very interesting because it's pushing that responsibility out. And what it's doing is it's saying to organizations, you cannot push this risk to a third party. You're responsible. So you have to make sure that that third party is managing the data in a secure way. And if anything goes wrong, you're responsible. So I think that's a really important shift. And then finally, I would say that one piece of DORA, which I find really forward thinking, is this requirement to have greater training and awareness within the business. Boards are required to know and understand what the risks are. People within organizations are required to have certain sets of training in respect to their jobs, their responsibilities, the types of data that they handle. So I think that's a really important development, because what we're doing is we're seeing a piece of legislation that is saying to the market, this isn't to sit within the legal department and it's not to sit within the IT department. This is a company-wide, business-wide requirement, and everybody needs to be involved. And I like this because this helps to operationalize resilience, and it helps to operationalize how we address cybersecurity within organizations, because it becomes everybody's responsibility, but also everybody's right. Everybody has a right to contribute to how they think this should work. Everybody has a right to introduce the procedures and policies that work for the organization in the best way possible to maximize the business value chain, whilst at the same time ensuring compliance. So I think that this is a really positive step forward.
Oh, that's brilliant. And are there any other strategies or frameworks that teams perhaps can develop to ensure that they're not just complying with DORA, but transforming that into more of a competitive advantage?
This is true. I think it's really great to look at the topics of information security and privacy as a competitive advantage, and how your organization can look to the future and use that trust and use your approach to operational resilience and your approach to how you interact with AI to really create that underlying trust in the market, brand trust as it were, and that people who are buying your product or using your services can feel secure, in the sense that the data that you have on them is held in a secure manner, it's used in an ethical way, and that it will be deleted when you're finished using it, that they don't have extra risk by being your customer. And I think that works in both the B2B environments and especially in the B2C environments. So having those frameworks in place whereby you can become a business enabler within the business, and you can use privacy and security as a competitive advantage, will really put your company in a stronger position for the future, because the future is about data, and there will be a lot of AI there, and being able to demonstrate that you understand what it is you're doing, how you're doing it, and that you can be transparent about that and trustworthy about that will be essential for organizations moving forward.
You talked about a bit before in terms of fines and penalties for cybersecurity breaches. We know the financial impact of data breaches can be devastating. We know these fines are increasing. And as you rightly said, it's not just the fines, but obviously the heavy long-term cost of reputational damage. How would you define the full spectrum of fines and penalties that many companies, could now be facing in the event of a breach?
I think a great way to look at it is the cost of data. So when we're looking at the different types of fines and penalties that can be imposed on organizations, they are cumulative. So that means that just because you have a fine under one piece of legislation doesn't mean that you won't have a fine under another. Remember that personal data is also business data. It could also breach whatever other pieces of legislation you are supposed to adhere to. So what's really important is that organizations understand the full spectrum and the interlay of the different pieces of legislation that they need to comply with. The majority of organizations are processing personal data, so they need to adhere to the GDPR, or the Data Protection Act in the UK. But you also need to understand, are you national or critical infrastructure? Do you have a link with DORA? Are you a financial institution? Are you an ICT provider into a financial institution? Does the AI Act come into play for you? Are you developing or deploying AI? So all of these pieces of legislation interact with each other, and remembering that if you have a breach, you might not be simply required to report that to the ICO. You could also have to report that to the NCSC, even to the police, depending on the type of information that has been breached. So I think it's important to look at all of the different types of legislation that you should require and adhere to. What are the fines associated with each of those pieces of legislation, but also what are the requirements in the event of a breach? So who should you notify and in what time frame? What information will they need? Think about as well your insurance. What kind of insurance do you have? Is your insurance adequate for the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in now? And also in the sense of a breach, what are the requirements that you have to have in place that you're still covered by insurance if you have a breach? And if you have a breach, how quickly do you need to notify your insurance company and in what circumstances? So I think there's a little bit of work there for organizations to do to fully understand not just the fines and the different kind of monetary penalties that can be put in place, but all of the different pieces of legislation, how they interact with each other, who is personally liable, who could face jail, who needs to be informed, when they need to be informed, what types of information they need to have if you're informing them, and kind of then underneath that, is your insurance adequate and what do you need to tell or do for your insurance company?
And in terms of mitigating exposure and making sure that the organisations are prepared for the inevitable legal consequences of an incident, what immediate steps can legal teams take?
I think having that playbook is a very important aspect to bear in mind. And I recently was speaking to a friend of mine about data breach policies, which can be quite long. And they had a great idea whereby they have a page within their data breach policy, which is, if you don't know this policy, if you've never read this policy before and you've had a breach, this is what to do. And I think that really short, concise, oh dear, what do we do now type piece of information is really important. So I'd say for legal, think about your policies as they are part of your compliance framework and as they build up that operational resilience and as they engage in that demonstrable compliance, but also think of your policies as playbooks. And maybe you might need some annexes at the back with checklists or to-do lists on what to do in the case of a breach. If you are part of the IT department, then you need to follow this playbook. If you're reading this and you're the person who clicked on the link, you need to do this, and you go to that piece of the playbook. So I think that's a great way of really making this accessible for the organization. And I think lawyers can have a key role in ensuring that these policies and procedures can actually become useful playbooks and not just policies that we look at once a year.
And how often should those playbooks, for instance, be tested and sort of put under scrutiny, do you think?
There's a lot of talk around how to test and how to test well. And the reality is, if you're doing one good test a year, I think you're in a better position than if you're doing very, very light tests a number of times a year. I think that boards and senior executives should do a tabletop exercise at least once a year to understand how things can go wrong and what they should do if things go wrong. I think always and continually testing your playbooks, even from the most basic aspect, which is a new person joins the organization and they're given the information security policy. And then you have just an informal chat with them afterwards. What did they understand? What did they take away? Did they even read it? Because you can test in a theoretical sense how wonderful your policy is. But if all the new people joining the organization aren't reading it or aren't understanding it, then you've fallen at the first hurdle. So the problem is probably more serious and more likely to occur. So I would always say, in the sense of thinking small to make a big picture, ensure that every person in the organization has read, understands, know what they need to do. If you're testing that, you're in a much stronger position for when something goes wrong than if you're doing a very expensive, externally supported tabletop exercise for uniquely the board once a year.
That's great. And look, you've played a proactive role in terms of sort of lowering the barriers of entry to individuals coming into the industry, as well as sort of raising awareness of the challenges women in tech are facing. So what piece of key advice would you give those that are entering the industry versus those that are looking to advance their career?
I would say be your own advocate. You have to get out there and speak highly of yourself. Be proud of who you are. The number of people that I speak to, both men and women, who have done amazing, remarkable things in their lives, who are wonderful people and who are just a pleasure to work with, but who don't know how to market themselves, who don't feel comfortable. And I think it's probably a cultural thing, who don't feel comfortable getting out there and singing their own praises. Be your number one advocate, because once you start, other people will see how great you are and they will support you in that. We can all lift each other up. I am always trying to help with individuals by mentoring or by giving advice. And remember that a mentor is not necessarily somebody who's going to mentor you in every single aspect of your career. They could be somebody who's done one thing particularly well that you want to emulate and that you want to do or learn that skill or develop that skill. So you can have a mentor for parts of your career. It doesn't have to be for your entire career. And you can be the person who is mentored to somebody much more junior. You can see somebody who's a rising star who does a particular thing very well. It's not about seniority, it's not about age. We can all help each other. So it's about really being able to recognize where are my areas of growth, who can help me with those areas of growth, and I am my number one advocate.
That's brilliant. And in terms of communicating with C-suite, you've got plenty of exposure there, and you've obviously seen a lot of success and some failures. So could you perhaps share with us your go-to analogy that you use when it comes to sort of communicating non-technical issues to those non-technical individuals?
A couple of years ago, I was speaking to a board about data privacy, and I could see that my message was not resonating and that it wasn't really getting through to them. So I just stopped and I said, guys, we need to think about personal data like a small child. It is in the business. Somebody needs to take its hand and bring it to where it needs to go. And really, we don't want a small child running randomly around the business. So once the purpose for the child being there is over, we need to kind of escort that child back to its parents and let it leave the building. And when we put it in those kind of easy terms, and it can be a different thing for different people, we really see how personal data is not about you can't do this, you can't do that, you need to, put on all these extra processes. We just need to care for it. We need to think about it like a small child who there is a reason that the small child is in the business or in the building, but once that reason is over, we need to help the small child leave so that we don't create more risk. And it's the same when it comes to training and awareness around cybersecurity. What I know and what I do are not necessarily the same thing. So if you have a policy and you think I've made people aware, that's not the same as people are now going to behave in a particular way. So you need to create that link between awareness and behavior change. And we do that by creating the opportunity for people to behave in a different way. We do it by creating the motivation, giving every department its own motivation to behave in a particular way, and the opportunity and capability. So how you can behave in that different way. And I do use the analogy of smoking. I know that smoking is bad for my health. However, I really love smoking. I enjoy it. It's part of my personality. It's what I do. I know that it's bad for my health, so I know that I should give up, but I don't have that capability, I don't have the opportunity, and I don't have the motivation. What can I do for myself to bring myself to a position where I'm enabling myself to change my behavior? And so, for example, I took up running. And I decided that I set myself a goal of running a marathon. And anybody who's ever run a marathon knows that it's really difficult to smoke and run marathons at the same time. So at some point, you need to make a decision. And the decision was made to do the marathon. And giving up smoking was never easy, but it was so much easier when I had that motivation and I had the opportunity, because I went running regularly, and I had the capability because in the beginning I used nicotine patches, and then I was able to move away from the nicotine patches. So really it's about creating that environment where people can change their behavior. So I guess I've given you two examples of ways that I explain both information security and how to care for personal data.
Yeah, no, some great advice, some great analogies, Annick. Yeah. So we've discussed some really good stuff, some really captivating topics, and I guess what we want to try and do now is maybe, you know, if you could share some key findings from the annual cybersecurity attitudes and behaviours report, and tell us a little bit more about CyberSafe on the back of that and some of the challenges you've been helping to navigate, and, you know, a bit more about the business as a whole.
Sure. So CyberSafe is a technology company that helps organizations manage and mitigate human cyber risk. We are looking to help individuals make safer digital decisions online. So what we're really trying to do is revolutionize the way that we think about cybersecurity. And it's not about technology, it's about people. It's about helping people, and it's about human cyber risk and looking at what those risks in a business are, how can we manage them, and how can we mitigate and bring down that risk by enabling people and giving them the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to make safer decisions. Every year we produce a report called the OBehave report, where we look at cybersecurity behaviors in the market. We look at the attitudes of people towards cybersecurity, and we do come out with some really interesting kind of results when we look at that. And one of the big ones that I'd like to talk about today is the fact that 40% of the people who responded to our questionnaires felt that cybersecurity training was confusing. So we know that every organization would have an annual requirement to do cybersecurity training. We also know that having an awareness about cybersecurity and what I should and shouldn't do is not the same as behaving in a particular way, doing or not doing those things. So we know that 15% of people who take training change their behavior based on that training, based on that annual training. And so we've got 15% of people who are likely to change their behavior based on one annual training, and we've got 40% of people who find it confusing. So we know that traditional training is not working. We know that awareness about cybersecurity is important. I should not click on links. We know that that awareness is there, but we know that people are having a hard time behaving in a particular way. We know that we need to help people to behave in a particular way. We need to give them that opportunity, and it's done in the form of constant nudges, reminders, in-time notifications, and training that really speaks to the department that you're in, the things that you find important for your business value chain, and how you need to operate as a business. So it's short modules, really accessible language that people can understand, so that it's not confusing, and so that we're moving away from that annual training to bite-sized modules, smaller pieces of information, a little bit of repetition over time, so that you're telling people things a number of times and it becomes embedded in how they operate and how they interact with the digital world and how they can make those safer decisions.
Important stuff, and I love the title "Oh Behave." For those of us old enough to remember Charles Hawtrey from the Carry On films, it resonates. So, what does the future hold for you and CyberSafe going forward?
Interesting times for us. AI is a huge part of the market moving forward, and we are very enthusiastic about AI. So for us, we're looking at how we can enable people to make safer digital decisions, but that also includes AI. So it's not looking at AI in a negative sense. It's saying, how can we use AI to be safer? We could use AI both in terms of the technical measures that organizations use to protect themselves, but also in terms of how individuals interact with those commonly used AI platforms and how they can do so in such a way that means that they're not leaking personal data, they're not leaking confidential business data. They're doing so in such a way that it maximizes the value that they can bring to the business. They can be the curators of the information that comes out of the AI machine, and we can use and harness this AI power to really propel businesses forward. At the same time, the humans, the people involved, have enough knowledge and they have that opportunity and motivation and capability to make those safe decisions, to minimize risk, and to identify if something has gone wrong so that you can detect, respond, and recover, to use the NIST words.
And look, exciting times ahead, clearly. For anyone who wants to sort of stay connected with you and CyberSafe, where else can they reach you?
They can always reach us at www.cybersafe.com. And me personally, I'm on LinkedIn, Annick O'Brien /compliance. So that's my super exciting title that I put on LinkedIn a couple of years ago, which I'm starting to have some questions about now. But hey, this is who I am, Annick O'Brien /compliance.
Well, look, it's been brilliant, Annick. Thank you so much. I'm sure the community and all our listeners have found a huge amount of value and insight in today's episode. If anyone wants to continue the discussion for more sustained engagement, we as always invite you to join the Secure Cyber Connect community, where we offer a range of collaborative solutions for both tech and security professionals at no cost. And as before, it's expansive community access, it's cross-sector mutual mentoring, there's weekly online networking sessions, and a range of exclusive interviews such as this, panel discussions and masterclasses to come. To learn more, gain access to the community and all our initiatives, please visit secure-recruitment.com/cyber-connect/. Thank you very much.